The air in Precinct 87 always tasted of stale coffee and desperation, but tonight, there was a metallic tang, like cold blood mixed with ozone. Detective Elias Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of sleepless nights, stared at the wall clock. 3 a.m. The witching hour had officially begun. Thorne wasn't supposed to be here. He was on administrative leave after the Blackwood fiasco, a case that ended with an empty witness chair and a dead end on his conscience. But the call that dragged him back wasn't official. It was a cryptic message left on his personal, untraceable burner phone. The architect is building. Location: the Asylum Annex, Unit 741. The Asylum Annex. Everyone in the precinct knew the history. Built in the 1950s, it was the overflow wing of the old state mental hospital, abandoned after a patient riot and mass disappearance in '86. It sat on the city's outskirts, a hulking, concrete tomb the city was too afraid to tear down. Thorne found the address, Unit 741, in the archived blueprints. It wasn't a standard room number. It was a holding cell in the annex's forgotten basement, a cell notorious for housing the Whistler, a serial killer who confessed to 23 murders before hanging himself on a bedsheet, his last act a haunting, high-pitched tune that allegedly echoed through the ventilation shafts for weeks that he drove alone, his old Ford Crown Victoria hugging the fog-choked road. The annex loomed, a silhouette against a sickly yellow moon. The entrance was chained, secured with an industrial padlock that had clearly been sawed open recently. Inside, the air was cold, thick with the smell of mold and something acrid, almost electrical. Thorne's flashlight beam danced across peeling paint and institutional green walls scored with decades of desperate scratch marks that he found Unit 741. The cell door was a heavy slab of steel, but it wasn't locked. It was propped open by a small object, a miniature, hand-carved wooden doll. It was unsettlingly detailed, a tiny, featureless head on a disproportionately long, thin body. Thorne pushed the door open. The cell was empty, except for a folding chair placed dead center. On the concrete floor, beneath the chair, was a large, meticulously rendered diagram drawn in what Thorne instantly recognized as fresh human blood. It wasn't a symbol. It was a complex, interlocking geometric pattern. A perfect, impossible non-Euclidean shape, a zero-sum design that seemed to both exist and not exist on the plane of the floor. As Thorne bent closer, his radio crackled to life. It wasn't his police frequency, it was a pure, unfiltered static. Then, a voice, deep and perfectly modulated, cut through the noise. It sounded like it was speaking directly from the center of the room. "Welcome back, Detective Thorne. I've completed the first phase of the design. You are the only officer who saw the blueprints. You, Thorne, are my anchor." The voice paused. Thorne drew his sidearm, scanning the dark cell, but the sound was everywhere and nowhere. "Look closer at the floor, Detective. The pattern is not merely a drawing. It is a lock. And the key is what you couldn't find in the Blackwood file." Thorne dropped his gaze back to the blood diagram. He noticed one detail he had missed. Interwoven into the complex geometry, barely visible, were faint lines of scratch marks. They looked ancient, deep, and familiar. They were the Whistler's signature scratches, the same ones found etched on the walls of his confinement room decades ago. But they were woven into the fresh blood diagram, somehow perfectly preserved and integrated, like the killer had drawn his pattern right over a message left 40 years ago. Thorne's breath hitched. This wasn't a killer replicating a style. This was two separate timelines collapsing into one, and the architect was somehow bridging them. Suddenly, a high-pitched, drawn-out whistle echoed from the air conditioning vent directly above him. It was a sound that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up, chillingly similar to the sound recordings of the Whistler's final moments. The radio static returned, and the voice delivered the final, chilling hook. "I need 12 anchors to complete the structure, Detective. You are one. You must find the others before they are integrated. You have until the next full moon. Good luck with the zeros." The radio went silent. Thorne stood alone in the dark, the scent of blood and ozone heavy in the air, staring at a diagram drawn in the present, but rooted in a horror from the past. The game had begun, and he was already standing in the killer's first trap. Detective Thorne didn't call the station. He knew what they'd say: a retired cop breaking into an abandoned building, reporting blood math, and an echoing phantom voice. He was officially a zero, and this case, he realized, needed to be just as unofficial. That he quickly photographed the grotesque diagram on the floor of Unit 741, ensuring every intricate bloody line and ancient scratch mark was captured. Before leaving, he pocketed the tiny, hand-carved wooden doll, the unsettling doorstop. It felt unnaturally cold in his palm. Back in his car, Thorne drove toward the precinct, but stopped a block away at a dingy, all-night diner. He needed coffee, and more importantly, he needed a name: Sergeant Victor Vic Reyes. Vic was a relic, a patrol sergeant with a photographic memory for old cases and a deep-seated distrust of clean answers. He was the only one Thorne trusted to understand the significance of the Asylum Annex scratches. "You look like you wrestled a ghost, Thorne," Vic grumbled, sliding into the booth. Thorne didn't mince words. He showed Vic the photos of the blood diagram and recounted the disembodied voice and the chilling, high-pitched whistle. Vic's eyes, usually cynical and weary, narrowed on the photo. "That geometry, that's not random. It looks like one of those old religious geometry sketches, but twisted. And those scratches, the whistlers," Thorne finished. "I checked the archives. The original intake report for the annex mentions those exact etchings. They were found on the walls of the cell before he even confessed." Vic took a long, shaky sip of his coffee. The Whistler's cell was Unit 741. He was the horror of that room. But why now? And what the hell is an anchor? The architect said he needed 12 of them to complete his structure. And he specifically mentioned I was the only officer who saw the Blackwood blueprints, Thorne said, leaning in. Blackwood was the informant who disappeared right before the trial. Everyone said I lost him. But the architect implied the key to the lock is what I couldn't find in the Blackwood file. Vic tapped the photo. Blackwood wasn't just an informant, Elias. He was a radio engineer, a genius with frequencies and static. He worked at the old municipal tower, maintaining the emergency broadcast system. Thorne felt a cold prickle run up his spine. The voice in Unit 741 had been pure static before it spoke. "The radio silence," Thorne muttered. "Static. The architect. The lock. It's not a physical key. It's an informational void." Vic pulled out a pen and scribbled a name and address on a napkin: Dr. Lena Hansen. Broadcast Museum archivist. Hansen was Blackwood's mentor. She practically raised him. If anyone knows what Blackwood was working on outside the file, something relating to frequencies or hidden messages, it's her. She lives out near the old tower. Thorne glanced at the address. It was in the affluent, quiet suburb of Elmwood. He immediately felt a surge of dread. The horror wasn't supposed to leave the dark confines of the annex. He arrived at Dr. Hansen's elegant, isolated home 30 minutes later. The lights were on, but the front door was slightly ajar, invitingly, too easily. Thorne drew his weapon before stepping into the foyer. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by a faint, persistent hissing sound, the sound of pure, unbroken radio static, coming from the living room. He found Dr. Hansen seated in an antique chair, facing a massive, old-fashioned, vacuum tube radio receiver sitting on a table. Her eyes were open, but vacant, staring directly ahead. She was utterly still. As Thorne approached, he saw the detail that made his blood run cold. She was not tied up, nor was she physically harmed. But resting on her lap, holding her hands down, were 12 identical, miniature, hand-carved wooden dolls, just like the one he'd pocketed at the annex. And then, he noticed the small, nearly invisible incision on her forehead. The cut was perfect, geometric, forming a tiny, inverted V shape. He checked for a pulse. None. Suddenly, the vacuum tube radio in front of her erupted with a loud, sharp burst of static, followed by the familiar, deep voice, "One anchor secured, detective. The structure accepts the zero-sum principle." She kept the secret of the waves. She was the key. "Now, you hold the zero." Thorne looked at the doll in his pocket, then at the 12 dolls resting on the dead archivist. The architect wasn't just killing people, he was turning them into components. And the first anchor, Dr. Hansen, had just been integrated into the architect's impossible geometry, leaving behind her own chilling signature. The 13 dolls, the radio static faded, replaced by the faint, persistent whistle from the vents, a cruel, mocking fanfare for the successful zero-sum operation. Thorne felt the cold reality of the room settle around him. Dr. Hansen's death wasn't messy, it was precise. The single, inverted, V incision on her forehead, a surgical mark, not a panic strike. The 12 dolls on her lap, plus the one in his pocket, totaled 13. He knew what he had to do. He called in a welfare check from a payphone 3 blocks away, keeping himself off the record. Then, he drove straight to Precinct 87. He needed Vic Reyes, and he needed a deep dive into the one file that had haunted him for months, the Blackwood case that he found Vic in the evidence room, surrounded by dusty boxes. "She's dead, Vic." Dr. Hansen. The architect got to her. Left her with 12 of those wooden dolls, just like the one I found. Thorne tossed the tiny, featureless doll onto the table. It landed with a soft, ominous thud. Vic picked it up, his brow furrowed. 12, plus yours. 13. That's not a coincidence, Elias. 13 is the number of unmaking in that Annex cult garbage. The Whistler was obsessed with it. And the Blackwood file, Thorne said, pulling out a faded manila folder. Blackwood was a brilliant engineer. The file says he was working on a silent frequency project for the city, a system to transmit encrypted messages during a blackout. But there's a gap in the report, 3 missing weeks of data. The key the architect mentioned. They spread the contents on the table, maintenance logs, schematics, and Blackwood's personal notes. One page was a hand-drawn diagram of a radio wave, a perfect, continuous sine wave, but with a single, small break in the pattern. Beside it, Blackwood had scribbled a word, hole. The zero-sum call, Vic breathed, looking at the diagram. A zero isn't just nothing, Elias. In engineering, a zero is a point of absolute silence on a frequency, a hole in the data stream. Blackwood wasn't just building a system to transmit. He was building a system to hide something inside the city's static. Thorne pointed to the geometric pattern from Unit 741's floor, pulling up the photo on his phone. The architect is using the Whistler's scratches, lines of madness, to complete Blackwood's hole. It's a lock made of geometry and static, designed to anchor something invisible. The anchors, Vic muttered. He's not collecting people. He's collecting knowledge, 12 pieces of specialized, forgotten expertise that, when combined, create this structure. And Dr. Hansen was the first, Thorne said, his voice flat. The anchor of static, she knew Blackwood's secret frequency. Suddenly, the security camera monitors in the corner, which were displaying the routine, boring feed of the precinct hallways, flickered, the screen went to pure white noise. The static was loud, hissing aggressively, then, a single word appeared, perfectly formed, in bright, shimmering blue on the snowy screen. The white noise vanished, and the feed returned to the normal, empty hallway. Thorne and Vic stared at the screen, heartbeats pounding in the silent room. He's inside the precinct system, Vic whispered, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. He's not just inside, Vic, Thorne corrected, picking up the Blackwood file. He is the system. He's operating in the zero, the gap, the static Blackwood created. He's telling us he's found Anchor 2. Vic looked at the file, then at Thorne's face, a terrible realization dawning. Who else saw the Blackwood blueprints, Elias? Who else knows all the names in that file who worked on the silent frequency project? Thorne quickly flipped through Blackwood's notes, landing on a short, handwritten list of names, the co-conspirators on the Silent Frequency Project.L. Hansen, Static, D. Keller, the architect of sound, R. Silas, the bridge, and 9 others. D. Keller, Thorne read aloud. Blackwood called him the architect of sound in his notes. Keller was a sound designer. He was the one who recorded the Whistler's last moments at the Annex for research before the riot. They said the tape was corrupted. The tape, Vic rasped. The whistle. Keller didn't just record it, he probably catalogued its exact frequency. He's the anchor of sound. Thorne grabbed his coat. The architect is using Keller to stabilize the sound component of his zero-sum lock. If he's already at 2, then he's moving fast. He looked at the small wooden doll, now resting innocently on the table. 13. We split up, Vic, Thorne commanded. I'm going after Keller. You take this doll and the file, and the photo of the blood geometry, to Chief Reynolds. Tell him you have an anonymous tip about the Hansen murder and a link to the old Whistler case. Don't mention the voice, the static, or me. Just the facts he can't dismiss. Vic nodded, stuffing the file into his jacket. Where do I tell the chief to start looking for this architect of sound? Thorne checked the address attached to D. Keller's name, an old, repurposed warehouse by the docks. Tell him to check the old acoustics lab near Pier 19. And tell him that the killer's calling card is the number of unmaking. Thorne turned and walked out, leaving the precinct to its temporary, unnerving silence. He was no longer hunting a killer, he was racing against a force that was weaponizing math, frequencies, and forgotten horror. The acoustics lab at Pier 19 was a skeletal structure of concrete and corrugated steel, abandoned years ago after the city shifted its port operations. The deep-water docks were deserted, the only sounds the lapping of the oil-slicked harbor water and the howl of the bitter, cold wind. Thorne approached D. Keller's supposed workspace, a large, sound-dampened room on the second floor. The door was ajar. Inside, the room was a chaotic monument to obsession. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting archaic audio equipment, reel-to-reel players, signal generators, and massive, floor-standing speakers. In the center, facing a series of sound-absorbing foam panels, sat D. Keller. Keller was a slight man, wearing a heavy pair of vintage noise-canceling headphones. He was hunched over a complex mixing board, his movements precise and focused, entirely oblivious to Thorne's presence. Thorne drew his weapon, the metallic click echoing in the otherwise silent room. Keller. Police. Turn around, slowly. Keller didn't move. He simply raised a finger, indicating 1 moment. Too late, detective. A voice, the architect's voice, emanated not from Keller, but from the speakers on either side of the room. It was crisp, high definition, and terrifyingly clear. Anchor 2 has just completed his synthesis. Thorne moved quickly, kicking a chair out of his way. As he reached the mixing board, he saw the final, chilling detail. Keller was not dead, but he was paralyzed. His eyes were wide with terror, staring at the complex audiograph displayed on a nearby monitor. His left hand was held rigid over the mixing board, pressed onto a button labeled zero-sum loop. He's not controlling the sound, detective, the architect continued, the voice pulsing through the speakers. The sound is controlling him. He's maintained the perfect frequency for me to integrate his knowledge, the sound map of the Whistler's final scream. Thorne glanced at Keller's forehead. There it was, the same tiny, inverted V incision, now weeping a single, dark droplet of blood. Resting neatly on the mixing board beside Keller were 13 miniature wooden dolls. The architect had clearly been thorough this time. What did you do to him? Thorne demanded, pointing his gun at the sound equipment. I simply used his own brilliance, detective. Blackwood found the hole, the frequency of informational silence. Keller identified the noise, the Whistler's final, perfectly consistent tone. As the architect finished, the room was flooded with the high-pitched, piercing whistle. It wasn't loud, it was the wrong kind of sound. It resonated deep in Thorne's inner ear, causing instantaneous vertigo and an agonizing pressure behind his eyes that he fell to one knee, covering his ears. The sound was not just a tone, it was a physical force, shaking the bones in his skull. Listen closely, Thorne. The whistler wasn't whistling a tune. He was broadcasting a message. The architect's voice cut through the noise, mocking. Thorne forced himself to look at the monitor. The audiograph wasn't displaying a simple tone, it was showing a series of complex pulses hidden within the high-frequency whistle. Keller's eyes, full of pleading horror, rolled toward the monitor. He couldn't speak, but he was trying to communicate. Thorne fought through the sonic assault, grabbing a heavy metal microphone stand and swinging it, smashing the massive speaker on his left. The whistling frequency immediately lost its symmetry, distorting and cutting off completely. Silence crashed back into the room, absolute and agonizingly sudden. Keller slumped, dead, his hand falling from the zero-sum loop button. The architect's voice returned, faint this time, through the single remaining speaker. A shame. He stabilized the second anchor just in time. The structure is now half-built, Detective. Static and sound. But the third anchor is already in motion. Anchor 3 is the bridge. Thorne rushed to the monitor, ignoring Keller's cooling body. The audiograph had saved itself before the crash. He looked at the sequence of pulses embedded in the whistle frequency. It was a rhythmic pattern, almost like Morse code, but impossibly complex. That he realized what he was looking at. The sound wasn't a death whistle. It was a time-stamped ledger. The pulses weren't random, they were dates and times, recorded and synthesized by Keller. He scrolled down the list, past the date of Blackwood's disappearance, past Dr. Hansen's death, past Keller's own time of integration, to the next entry, a date and time that was exactly 36 hours from now. Below the date was a new name from Blackwood's list, highlighted in red. Silas, the bridge. Silas's address was listed as a high-security communications hub, a place where all the city's data streams converged. The architect was not just killing people, he was following a schedule, an invisible timeline dictated by the horror of the past. The whistler's final whistle was the key, providing the timing for the architect's 12-part ritual. Thorne pocketed the recording reel containing Keller's final synthesis, leaving the 13 wooden dolls as the architect's signature. He had 36 hours before Anchor 3 was taken. He ran from the lab, the cold wind hitting his face. He called Vic, who was now dealing with a very confused and angry Chief Reynolds. Vic. Forget the chief. Keller is dead. The architect is working off a schedule. A ledger hidden in the whistler's whistle. The next one is Silas, the bridge. Find out everything you can about Silas's work, anything relating to data convergence or hidden timelines. We have 36 hours. Thorne met Vic in a desolate parking garage far from the precinct. The city lights seemed distant, muted, as if the world was holding its breath. Vic was visibly rattled, having just navigated a shouting match with Chief Reynolds. The chief is furious, Elias. Hansen's death is officially a professional hit, but the brass won't touch the zero-sum psychobabble. I managed to bury the 13 dolls and the photo of the blood geometry, for now. Thorne leaned against the hood of his car, the reel of Keller's recording clutched in his hand. Good. Because this isn't about professional hits, Vic. It's about a timetable. Keller's sound synthesis confirms it. The whistler's last noise wasn't static, it was a rhythmic pulse sequence. A clock. And the next chime? Silas. The bridge. He's scheduled for integration in 36 hours. His address is the main communications hub, the nexus where all municipal data converges. We need to know what the bridge means. Vic had done his homework. He pulled out a crumpled printout, a profile of Robert Silas. Silas is a data systems expert. Blackwood brought him in to design the routing for the Silent Frequency project. Specifically, how to create a data tunnel. A bridge that could exist outside the standard municipal network. A ghost line. A timeline, Thorne corrected, a terrible realization dawning. Blackwood created a hidden frequency, the whole. Keller gave it a sound, the Whistler's clock. And Silas created the timeline, a separate, parallel stream of data where the architect can operate unseen. Thorne spread out the three pieces of evidence on the hood of the car, the photo of the geometric blood pattern, Blackwood's diagram of the hole, and the sound reel of the clock. Look at the geometry, Vic. It's interlocking. It's a map. The architect is using these anchors to build a structure in the hidden timeline. A place where the rules of time and sanity don't apply. And what happens when the structure is complete? Thorne stared at the bloody geometry, feeling a wave of icy dread. I don't know. But the architect called me his anchor. I saw the Blackwood blueprints. I am the physical point of reference. He needs me to acknowledge the horror he's building. We need to get to Silas. Now, Vic urged. They drove to the communications hub, a sprawling, anonymous building secured by layers of digital and physical defenses. Robert Silas was known for working long, solitary hours. They managed to bypass a nervous security guard Vic knew, gaining access to the high-security server room where Silas worked. The air in the room was cold and loud with the rhythmic whirring of thousands of servers. Robert Silas was there, sitting in front of a bank of monitors, his eyes focused on a dizzying cascade of code. Silas, a man in his late 50s with the pale complexion of someone who hadn't seen daylight in years, turned, startled by their entry. Thorne? Reyes? What the hell are you doing here? This is high-security data. We're trying to save your life, Silas, Thorne said, keeping his voice low and urgent. You worked with Blackwood and Hansen on the Silent Frequency project, the bridge. An architect is using that project to kill people and he's coming for you. Silas scoffed, adjusting his glasses. The Silent Frequency? That was shut down years ago. A dead project. They couldn't make the timeline synthesis work. The data always corrupted itself. Tell me about the timeline synthesis, Thorne pressed. It was Blackwood's holy grail, Silas explained, typing frantically on his keyboard, pulling up old files. He wanted to compress all municipal records, police, traffic, utilities, onto that hidden frequency, effectively creating an alternate city data stream that existed 2 seconds behind the real time. The bridge was the code designed to synthesize the two streams without crashing the network. 2 seconds behind, Vic whispered. A ghost city. But the data was unstable, Silas insisted. It kept pulling in anomalous corruption, ghost data. Blackwood called it echoes of unmaking. We shut it down. No one knows the code for the bridge. Suddenly, the whirring of the servers changed. It didn't stop, but the sound became unnatural, a high-pitched drone that vibrated the fillings in their teeth. The monitors around them flickered violently, the cascading code being overwritten by something else. On the main monitor, the entire screen dissolved into a pulsing, intricate geometric pattern, the exact blood geometry from Unit 741. And then, the voice, the architect's voice, spoke from every single speaker in the server room, amplified to a deafening, echoing roar. You shut down the bridge, Silas. But you left the echoes. They are data points, anchored to the timeline. I am simply cleaning the corrupted files. Silas screamed, clutching his head as the geometric pattern pulsed on the screen, seeming to physically drill into his mind. Thorne lunged for the server's main power switch, but Vic grabbed his arm, pointing to a small, isolated console in the corner. That's the manual override for the bridge's routing. Silas, how do we shut down the timeline synthesis from there? Silas, racked by the sonic assault, managed to point a shaking finger at a panel on the floor. The physical tap. You have to cut the physical connection to the hidden frequency. Thorne didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy fire axe from the wall. The architect's voice roared, filling the room with terrifying, geometric noise. Anchor 3 is essential. The bridge must hold the timeline. The Whistler demands the full ledger. Thorne swung the axe down, not at the server, but at the point on the floor Silas indicated. The steel blade struck the concrete, tearing through the hidden, specialized fiber optic cable that connected the hub to Blackwood's ghost line. A terrifying, high-pitched whistle, the Whistler's signature, erupted from the servers, reaching a shattering crescendo. Then, everything died. The lights, the fans, the monitors, absolute silence and pitch black. Thorne quickly turned on his flashlight. Silas was slumped over his console, unconscious. And on the table next to him, placed neatly amidst the dead technology, were 13 miniature wooden dolls. The bridge was cut. Anchor 3 was secured. But was Silas dead, or merely integrated? Thorne checked Silas's forehead. No inverted V incision. Silas was breathing, deeply unconscious, but alive. He's still here, Vic, Thorne gasped. We cut the connection just in time. The architect couldn't finish the integration. Silas is compromised, but he's not an anchor yet. Thorne picked up one of the wooden dolls. The horror had a physical signature, a terrifying calling card of unmaking. He knew the architect would strike again, probably sooner than 36 hours. We need to wake Silas up, Vic. He knows the next name on that list, and we need to understand the echoes, the ghost data the architect is weaponizing. Thorne and Vic dragged the barely conscious Robert Silas to a safe house, a dilapidated, forgotten maintenance shed Thorne occasionally used as a clandestine operation base. Silas was physically intact, but mentally shattered. His eyes darted around the room, tracking invisible lines and hearing the ghost static only he could perceive. The geometry. Silas whispered, his voice dry and fragile, hours after the incident. It's not code. It's memory. Pure, architectural memory. Thorne leaned in, holding a cup of cold water to Silas's lips. Tell us about the echoes, Robert. What were the echoes of unmaking? Silas shuddered, his mind still trapped on the edge of the digital abyss. When the bridge code tried to synthesize the hidden frequency, Blackwood's ghost line, it didn't just pull in bad data. It pulled in residual psychic energy. The horror, Thorne. The city's worst moments are recorded in the very foundations. Ghost data, Vic muttered, horrified. The Asylum riot, the mass disappearances, the Old Wharf murders, the terror of those moments became data points in the hidden timeline, Silas continued. The Whistler's frequency, it wasn't a tune. It was a tuning fork. It stabilized those echoes. The architect is integrating the anchor's knowledge, static, sound, timeline, to give the echoes structure. Why? What is the structure building towards? Thorne demanded. Silas forced himself to look at Thorne, a moment of sanity cutting through the terror. A gate. Blackwood's notes talked about the zero-sum principle, creating a void where two timelines meet. The architect is building a physical structure in the hidden timeline to force that gate open. And he needs architecture to complete the foundation. Thorne pulled out the partially burned list from the Blackwood file, pointing to the next name. Who is Anchor 4? Dr. Evelyn Reed. Reed. The anchor of memory, Silas confirmed, his voice barely audible. She's the city's leading architectural historian. She catalogued the real blueprints for every building the city tried to forget. She knows the structural faults, the hidden rooms, the sealed-off parts of the city's bones. Where would she be working on the forgotten structures? Vic asked. The old City Hall archives, Silas said. Deep underground. Where the original, hand-drawn plans for the Asylum Annex are kept, the ones that show the tunnels they sealed after the '86 riot. Suddenly, Silas's vacant eyes focused intensely on Thorne. He wasn't looking at Thorne, he was looking through him, at something only visible in the static. He's talking to you, Thorne, Silas gasped, clutching his chest. The architect. He said, he said, "the 13th anchor is waiting for his purpose. You hold the key of the impossible diagram, detective. Without your acknowledgement, the structure is merely a scribble." The architect was treating Thorne not as an obstacle, but as the final, necessary component. The 13th anchor, the one who saw the structure and granted it reality. The 13 dolls, Vic realized, his face pale. The killer's signature isn't 12 anchors. It's 13. The 12 integrated experts, and the one who accepts the horror. Thorne pocketed the 13th doll from Silas's table, the chill of the wood now a familiar dread. He left Vic to watch over Silas and drove toward the old city hall. The city hall was a granite behemoth, its history etched in its decaying facade. Thorne knew the archives were buried 3 floors below street level, a windowless tomb where paper decay was the only sound that he found the access door to the archives, a heavy steel barrier secured by an ancient, combination dial lock. The lock was untouched, however. Taped directly onto the center of the steel door was a clean, white envelope, addressed simply to, the 13th anchor. Thorne tore it open. Inside was a single, laminated photograph. It wasn't a picture of Dr. Reed. It was an aerial shot of Precinct 87, Thorne's own station. And drawn in bold, perfect red marker over the satellite. Image was a circle, highlighting the basement evidence room, the very room where Vic was just hours ago, and written below the photo in elegant script, "The archivist of stone has completed her integration, detective. Her memory of the depths is now mine. Anchor 4 is secure. The structure's foundation is set. Your precinct is built on the purest of the city's echoes. Come home, Thorne. It is time for Anchor 5 to be revealed." Thorne stared at the picture of his own station, the metallic tang of fear now overwhelming the scent of the city. The architect was not only ahead of him, he had already been to the deepest part of the city's memory and had now planted the horror right back in the heart of the police force. Dr. Reed was already gone. He raced back toward Precinct 87, dread pooling in his gut. The architect hadn't just integrated the memory of the city structure, he had identified the structural fault in Thorne's own world. Thorne drove back to Precinct 87 with a speed bordering on reckless desperation. The architect had breached the city's defenses and was now operating within the heart of its law enforcement. The note was clear, the precinct itself was built on an echo. He burst through the back entrance and immediately found Vic Reyes in the deserted records room, frantically tearing through old municipal property documents. "Vic! Dr. Reed is gone. The architect was ahead of us. He sent a note, he was targeting the precinct itself." Thorne slapped the aerial photo of Precinct 87 down on the desk. Vic's eyes widened at the sight of the circled evidence room. "I was just looking into this. Reed was cataloging the original survey for this site. This building was erected in '68, right? Except, the original plan showed an anomaly, a pre-existing sub-basement that the city engineers were ordered to seal and ignore." "An echo," Thorne said, his voice flat. "What was sealed down there?" Vic pulled out a fragile, yellowed blueprint. "It wasn't part of the police station. Before '68, this entire block was the site of the city's temporary detention center, a holding facility for unstable individuals transferred from the Asylum Annex before the riot." Thorne felt the cold logic of the horror snap into place. The architect was connecting the dots. The annex, the Whistler, and the forgotten holding cell right beneath their feet. The architect is using Dr. Reed's knowledge of the foundation to give the structure a physical base, Thorne stated. "We have to get down there." They found the access point in the furthest corner of the boiler room, a heavy, bolted hatch disguised poorly with discarded equipment. The bolts were old, rusty, but the central securing pin had clearly been removed. Thorne pulled the hatch open. A gust of cold, foul-smelling air, a mixture of decay and the familiar electric tang, pushed out. They descended into the pitch black using a narrow, rusted iron ladder. The sub-basement was vast, circular, and low-ceilinged. It was an institutional dungeon, concrete cells lining the walls, and a thick, oppressive silence that swallowed their flashlight beams. Unlike the annex, these walls were smooth, wiped clean of desperation, making the forgotten history feel even heavier. In the center of the room, the architect had erected his current workspace. It wasn't a bloody altar, but a precise, architectural model. A perfect, miniature replica of the entire Asylum Annex, built meticulously from carved wood, the same wood used for the 13 dolls. It sat on a massive, circular table. Around the table, sitting in chairs, were 4 bodies. They were Dr. Hansen, Static, D. Keller, Sound, Dr. Reed, Memory, and Robert Silas, Timeline. All 4 wore the V incision. All 4 were meticulously propped up, staring blankly ahead. The first 4 anchors were integrated, and resting on the table, amidst the architecture, were 4 sets of 13 wooden dolls, a total of 52. Thorne scanned the room, raising his gun, but the architect was nowhere to be seen. Then, the architect's voice boomed from the sound system he had rigged in the sub-basement, a voice of chilling triumph. "Welcome home, Detective. The foundation is set. The architecture of the void requires one element more, the engine to drive the zero-sum principle." Thorne pointed his flashlight at the chairs. There was a 5th, empty chair, facing the other 4 integrated anchors. Anchor 5 is currently observing the structure, Detective. He holds the engine, the method of infinite, automated recursion needed to keep the bridge open. He is your partner. Thorne's blood ran cold. He turned to Vic Reyes, who was standing frozen by the ladder. Vic's face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He wasn't looking at the gruesome scene, he was staring at his own hands. "Vic?" Thorne asked, his voice strained. Vic slowly raised his hand to his forehead, and Thorne saw it, a tiny, surgical razor blade held between Vic's thumb and forefinger. "The engine is me, Elias," Vic whispered. His voice sounding hollow, like the echo of a man standing in a deep well. "I wasn't guarding Silas, I was retrieving the recursion key he hid in the bridge's old code. I worked on the power source for the Silent Frequency project." Vic, the man Thorne trusted, the keeper of old knowledge, was Anchor 5. The architect hadn't needed to hunt him, Vic had been the sleeping anchor all along. Vic's expression shifted, the fear replaced by a terrifying calmness. He pressed the razor blade gently against his own forehead, right above the eyebrow. "Thorne. I trusted you. But the architect showed me the truth. You are the 13th anchor. The witness. Now, I give the engine to the structure." Thorne screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. Vic made a swift, surgical cut, the inverted V, and a single drop of blood formed. Simultaneously, a deep, rhythmic hum, the sound of an engine starting, emanated from the model of the Asylum Annex. Vic slumped into the 5th chair, eyes open, integrated. The model of the annex now hummed with power, its architecture animated by 5 terrifying sources of specialized knowledge. On the table next to Vic, 13 more wooden dolls appeared from seemingly nowhere, settling next to the engine. Thorne stood paralyzed, his partner now a component in the architect's infernal design. The radio he wore crackled to life, the architect's voice triumphant and terrifying. 5 down. The structure is stable, Detective. The guilt of the precinct, the forgotten history beneath your feet, is now the engine's fuel. Anchor 6 is the anchor of faith. He requires a specific location for his integration, a place of desperate belief. The radio static cleared, replaced by a cold, high-pitched whistle that reverberated off the concrete walls of the forgotten sub-basement. The rhythmic, deep hum emanating from the miniature Asylum Annex model filled the sub-basement, a sickening lullaby for the 5 integrated anchors. Thorne stared at the lifeless, staring eyes of Vic Reyes, his partner, friend, and now, the engine of a supernatural structure. The guilt was a heavy, physical weight, the precinct itself now feeling like a tomb built on a lie. He couldn't stay. The architect had sealed the hatch leading to the boiler room. Thorne's only exit was a narrow, grated utility tunnel at the far end of the sub-basement, an emergency drainage route detailed in Dr. Reed's forgotten plans that he squeezed through the rusted grating and crawled through the fetid, concrete tunnel until he emerged onto a deserted, rain-slicked side street, blocks away from Precinct 87. He was now officially a ghost, operating outside the law he swore to uphold, running from a station that had become a monument to the city's dark history. Thorne pulled out the partially burned anchor list. Next up, Anchor 6. Anchor of Faith, Thorne muttered, remembering the architect's final pronouncement. A place of desperate belief. He flipped through the archives of Blackwood's notes, finding a section on ritual logistics. A. Vance, the prophet, the anchor of faith. Specialist in the symbolic architecture of belief systems. Final location for project integration, the Whispering Chapel. Thorne recognized the name. The Whispering Chapel was an abandoned, non-denominational church built near the old state highway. It was notorious for a small, fanatical cult in the 1980s that claimed the Whistler was not a killer, but a prophet whose final whistle was a divine prophecy. The cult dissolved after the Whistler's death, leaving behind a church filled with bizarre, esoteric carvings that he had to get there before the scheduled integration time. He had a faint, terrifying idea. The architect wasn't just collecting knowledge, he was creating a ritual of unmaking based on the number 13. The drive was a blur of flashing rain and adrenaline. He arrived at the chapel, a Gothic revival structure with broken stained glass and a crumbling bell tower that looked like a skeletal finger pointing at the sickly moon. The front door was splintered open. Inside, the main sanctuary was dark, dust motes dancing in the beam of his flashlight. The air was cold, but smelled of burning incense and something else, something distinctly metallic, like the sub-basement. In the center of the sanctuary, where the altar once stood, the architect had placed his second display, a massive, open Bible, carved into the floor itself. The pages were rendered in concrete, and the text was not legible. It was the same terrifying, interlocking geometric pattern from Unit 741, etched deep into the stone. The pattern wasn't drawn in blood this time, it was highlighted by a dozen flickering, black candles. Anchor 6, Dr. Arthur Vance, was positioned precisely in the middle of the geometric altar. He was a frail, elderly man, dressed in a faded cassock, kneeling in a posture of profound supplication. He was clearly alive, his lips moving silently in prayer. Thorne saw the architect, or the man he believed to be the architect, standing over Vance. He was tall, dressed in sterile white garments that seemed eerily out of place, almost like a surgeon's scrubs. He was clean-shaven, utterly anonymous, and held a small, polished wooden staff in his hand, the same wood as the doll's. "Stop! Police!" Thorne yelled, raising his weapon. The figure didn't flinch. He slowly raised his hand, pointing the wooden staff at the geometric floor pattern. "The 13th anchor arrives on schedule." The architect's voice was calm, almost liturgical, emanating from the very stones of the church. "Dr. Vance has found his final scripture. He is transcribing the faith required to make the impossible real." Thorne saw what Vance was doing. With painstaking precision, the old man was using a sharp metal stylus to carve the inverted V into his own forehead. He was integrating himself. "Vance, don't. You're being used," Thorne shouted, rushing forward. "Used?" Vance's voice was a dry rattle, eyes rolling up to meet Thorne's. "No, detective. I am giving form to the only true prophecy. The Whistler saw the geometry in the madness, and the architect is merely the hands of unmaking." As Thorne closed the distance, the architect moved with unnatural speed, not toward Thorne, but toward the bell tower. Before disappearing into the darkness, he spoke one final word: "Look to the source of the faith, detective. The structure requires a physical sign." Thorne ignored the fleeting figure, focusing on Vance. He grabbed the stylus from the old man's hand, stopping the final depth of the cut. The inverted V was bleeding, but the integration hum wasn't starting. "The source. What is the source, Vance?" Thorne demanded, shaking the man. Vance weakly pointed a trembling finger upward, towards the bell tower. The bell," they thought it was the voice of God. But it was just the material, the geometry of the sound. Thorne saw it then. The chapel bell, visible through the shattered roof. It wasn't bronze. It was a dull, dark metal, and etched into its side, so faint as to be invisible from the ground, was the chilling signature of the whistler, a complex series of scratches. The whistler hadn't just used his voice. He had used the bell's material to broadcast the sound geometry that integrated Keller. The architect was moving to destroy the physical material of the anchor of faith. Suddenly, a massive, deafening crack echoed from the tower. The sound wasn't a bell ringing, it was the sound of structural steel tearing apart. The architect was destabilizing the tower. Thorne looked down at Vance. The old man was slumped, unconscious, but still alive. The 13 wooden dolls appeared, resting on the carved scripture. Anchor 6 was integrated, but the physical ritual was incomplete. Thorne knew he had to save the bell, the physical material of the faith, to prevent the architect from gaining total control over this component. He raced toward the back of the chapel, the final section of the whistler's ledger now burning in his mind. Anchor 7, the anchor of time. Thorne sprinted toward the crumbling base of the bell tower. The architectural integrity of the structure was visibly failing, huge cracks spider-webbed across the stone, raining down debris. The architect had rigged the support beams to fail, aiming to destroy the bell, the physical source of Anchor 6, faith, and the material linked to the whistler's frequency. He scrambled up the internal scaffolding, the air thick with dust and the deep, pervasive hum of the newly integrated engine back at Precinct 87, now somehow audible even here. He reached the bell chamber. The architect, still in his unsettling white surgical attire, was standing on a precarious ledge, a thick, acid-filled container in his hands. He was ready to pour it onto the dark, ancient bell. "You're too late, detective," the architect announced, his voice carrying an unnerving calm. "The architect of faith has completed his transcription. Now, the material must be neutralized. The zero-sum demands the unmaking of the source." Thorne didn't waste time talking. He fired a warning shot, aiming deliberately at the stone wall inches from the architect's head. The force of the shot startled the figure, making him momentarily lose his balance. "The structure won't hold," Thorne yelled, advancing slowly. "You integrate anchors, but you destroy the physical evidence." "Why?" The architect recovered, a cold smile touching his lips. "Evidence is static, detective. The structure needs dynamic memory. The source materials, the bell, the cell geometry, are too rooted in the past. They must be unmade to transition the knowledge into the hidden timeline. The knowledge is digitized, the material is obsolete." With a sudden, fluid motion, the architect threw the acid container. Thorne ducked, but the corrosive liquid splashed onto the wooden support beams, which immediately began to smoke and dissolve. The architect didn't wait. He leaped across the gap to the opposite wall, disappearing through a narrow maintenance window. Thorne rushed to the bell. The ancient metal, etched with the whistler's scratches, was intact. He had saved the physical source of the anchor of faith, at least for now. But the bell tower itself was now dangerously unstable. He climbed out of the maintenance window where the architect vanished, finding himself on the chapel roof. The architect was already gone, disappearing into the cover of the dense woods bordering the property. Thorne checked his watch, feeling the constant pressure of the whistler's silent clock. The schedule was relentless. He needed the next anchor. He retrieved the final page of Blackwood's notes, the ledger now chillingly reduced to only 7 remaining names. Anchor 7, J. Elias, the chronographer. The anchor of time. Thorne recalled the name, Jonathan Elias. A retired academic, the city's foremost expert on historical synchronicity, the study of repeating patterns and coincidences in city history. He drove to Elias's isolated cottage, deep in the academic district. Elias was an eccentric, known for charting every minor event and death in the city. Searching for a temporal pattern, Thorne found the cottage door unlocked, a light on inside. He entered cautiously. The interior was a nightmare of documentation. Every wall was covered floor to ceiling in charts, timelines, and graphs. Pins and strings connected dates, names, and locations. A dizzying map of the city's history charted across time, and in the center of the room, seated at a massive desk, was Jonathan Elias. He was alive, his eyes fixed on a specific chart on the wall. The chart was titled, The Zero-Hour Convergence, July 13, 1986. The date of the Asylum riot. As Thorne approached, Elias raised a hand, not in fear, but in concentration. "Detective Thorne," Elias said, his voice slow and preoccupied. "I finally saw it. The temporal geometry of the unmaking. Blackwood's hole, Keller's clock, Silas's bridge, they all point to this date." He tapped the chart. The entire timeline focused on that riot. But Elias had added something new to the chart, a complex, 13-point star drawn over the original timeline. "The architect isn't just killing people, Detective," Elias continued, frantic now. "He's using the anchor's knowledge to physically reenact the riot on the hidden timeline. He's building the structure to force a temporal bleed, to make the past a reality." Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker rapidly, synchronizing with a fast, urgent pulse sound emanating from the charts themselves, a sound of rushing, distorted time. Elias clutched his head, his face contorted in agony. "He's integrating my knowledge now. The anchor of time. He needs the coordinates, the precise historical intersection point." Thorne looked around, spotting the 13th wooden doll already resting on Elias's desk, next to a small, intricate set of brass instruments. Thorne grabbed a heavy textbook and smashed the brass instruments, Elias's instruments for calculating synchronicity. The temporal pulsing stopped, and the light stabilized. Elias slumped, but alive. He quickly pointed to the chart before losing consciousness. "The coordinates. They are in the city census building. The only place with the original land registry that conflicts with the '86 riot report. Anchor 8, he needs the ground." Thorne looked at the chart. The 13-point star had been completed. The knowledge of time was integrated. He checked Elias's forehead. No inverted V. The temporal instruments had been the key, not the ritualistic cut. The architect was adapting, speeding up. Thorne grabbed the final, shocking piece of evidence Elias had isolated on the chart. The location Blackwood's data kept pointing to during the riot, the old city census building. And the next name on the list, Anchor 8, S. Harper, the surveyor. Thorne left the unconscious Jonathan Elias, anchor of time, and the terrifying map of temporal geometry behind. He drove toward the old city census building, a monolithic structure that housed the forgotten paper trails of the city's entire existence, including the original land registry maps. Anchor 8 was Dr. Samuel Harper, the surveyor, the city's chief land surveyor, who had worked with Blackwood on the annex expansion, specifically the underground infrastructure. The architect was now building the final physical layer of his structure, the ground. Thorne managed to gain entry through a forgotten utility access point. Inside, the census building was vast, dusty, and silent, rows upon rows of steel filing cabinets creating an endless labyrinth. He found Harper in the sub-basement map room, surrounded by massive rolls of parchment. Harper was not sitting, he was standing perfectly still, his body rigid, and there, standing over him, was the architect. He was no longer in sterile white, he was wearing the soiled, dusty attire of a construction foreman, complete with a hard hat. The 13 dolls rested on a central map table. "I see you've kept up, Detective," the architect said, not turning around, his voice echoing in the vast, empty room. "The 13th anchor is persistent. But you cannot prevent the structure from taking root." Thorne raised his weapon. "Harper. Step away from the architect." Harper's voice was slow, robotic, and strained. I must complete the coordinates, Thorne. The ground must be charted. The axis of unmaking must be located." Thorne saw what Harper was holding, an antique surveying instrument, a heavy brass transit, aimed at a specific, empty point on the far wall. The transit was humming with the familiar electric tang, radiating power. The architect moved quickly, picking up a sledgehammer leaning against the wall. He pointed it at a section of the floor beneath Harper. "The surveyor's knowledge is of the ground, detective. The structure needs to know where the city is weakest, the fault line beneath the asylum. And Harper's maps reveal the true center of the echoes." Thorne looked at the map Harper was focused on. It was a 19th-century land registry. A section of the map, directly beneath where the Asylum Annex was later built, was marked with a different symbol, a tiny, hand-drawn 13-point star. "What is that?" Thorne demanded. "That," the architect replied, his voice chillingly excited, "is the city's original miasma pit. A septic, chemical pit dug in the 1890s, used by the original hospital for unwanted biological material. The perfect physical ground for the echoes to emerge." The architect raised the sledgehammer. "The structure is now complete: static, sound, timeline, memory, engine, and faith. All knowledge integrated. Now, I use the ground to break the surface." Thorne fired a shot, aiming for the architect's legs. The bullet struck the brass transit that Harper was holding. The instrument exploded in a shower of sparks and acrid smoke. Harper instantly went limp, collapsing onto the map table, the inverted V cut already visible on his forehead. The integration was complete. The architect ignored the explosion, instead slamming the sledgehammer down onto the concrete floor at the spot where the transit had been aimed. Crack. The floor fractured violently, the crack spreading outward in the shape of a perfect, geometric V. "Anchor 8 is secured. The ground is broken." The architect yelled triumphantly. He then sprinted toward a narrow shaft in the corner, a forgotten ventilation duct. "The location, Thorne. The ground has given us the final location." The architect shouted, his voice echoing back up the shaft. Thorne rushed to the fractured floor, shining his light into the gaping crack. He saw a deep, dark cavity, and felt a profound sense of wrongness emanating from the depths, the miasma pit. On the fractured map table, beneath the motionless body of Harper, the final section of the Blackwood ledger had been exposed by the shattered brass transit. Only 4 names remained: Anchor 9, Klein, the keeper. The Anchor of Law. Anchor 10, E. Vane, the seer. The Anchor of Vision. Anchor 11, C. Darnell, the hand. The Anchor of Execution. Anchor 12, Chief Reynolds, the head. The Anchor of Authority. Thorne froze. Chief Reynolds. The final anchor, the head of the precinct. The architect's plan wasn't just to build a structure, it was to invert the entire city's sense of order and law, and the next target, Anchor 9, Captain Adam Klein, the commander of the precinct's evidence lockup, the man who guarded the physical remnants of the city's worst crimes. The Anchor of Law. Thorne grabbed a clean section of the map, noting the coordinates of the miasma pit, and raced out of the census building. He knew where the architect was headed next, to the one place in the city designed to hold the physical record of its guilt. The precinct was compromised. Vic was gone. And now, the chief was the ultimate target. Thorne had to get to Captain Klein before the architect could claim the physical Anchor of Law and proceed to Anchor 12, the head of the entire structure. Thorne sped back towards Precinct 87, a ghost racing towards a city built on shattered timelines and buried secrets. The final phase of the architect's plan was unfolding rapidly, aiming for the inversion of authority itself. He bypassed the main entrance, instead using the old maintenance tunnels to enter the evidence wing. The entire precinct felt wrong. The air was heavy, and the faint, rhythmic hum of the engine, Vic Reyes, was now a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very concrete. Thorne reached the evidence lockup, a secured vault housing the physical remnants of the city's darkest crimes. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar, secured open by one of the dreaded 13 wooden dolls. He entered the vault. The room was cold, sterile, and filled with decades of packaged guilt. Captain Adam Klein, the keeper, a stern, meticulous man responsible for the chain of custody, was standing rigid in the center of the room. He was staring at a specific item placed on the central inventory desk, an ancient, rusted metal box. Standing over Klein was the architect, now wearing a faded, dust-covered prison guard uniform. He held a small, specialized laser cutter. "The 13th anchor returns to the source of the law," the architect stated, his voice a low, commanding rasp. "Captain Klein is the anchor of law, the knowledge of all things lost and found. And that box contains the true zero point of the entire structure." Thorne moved quickly, gun leveled. "Stop, architect. What is in the box?" Klein, his eyes glazed over, spoke with a chilling authority. "The evidence is the law, Thorne. The law is the evidence. This box, this is what the Whistler left behind. Not the dolls, not the whistle, but the tool." The architect aimed the laser cutter at the lock of the rusted metal box. The Whistler was not just a killer, he was a surveyor of reality. He used this tool to create the original geometric scratch marks, the lines of unmaking, that you found in Unit 741. It is the executioner's gauge. Anchor 9 possesses the knowledge of where we catalogued it. Thorne fired, aiming for the laser cutter. The architect moved with impossible speed, deflecting the shot with his forearm, the laser cutter surviving the impact. The architect merely grunted, a thin line of red appearing on his arm. "You are too slow, detective. The structure demands its key." The architect pressed the laser cutter against the lock. The metal sizzled and glowed. Klein slumped forward, the inverted V incision appearing instantly on his forehead as his knowledge of the law's guilt, the concealed truth of the Whistler's methods, was integrated. The architect had bypassed the ritualistic cut, using the energy of the laser through the anchor. Anchor 9 was secured, the lock clicked open. The architect lifted the heavy lid of the box. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was the executioner's gauge, a small, intricate tool made of dark, polished wood and brass, designed to carve impossible geometry into any surface. It was identical in material to the wooden dolls, but clearly the master tool. As the architect reached for the gauge, Thorne saw his opportunity. He lunged across the desk, tackling the figure. They hit the concrete floor in a chaotic scramble. Thorne tore the hard hat and uniform away from the architect's face, revealing the man beneath the guise that he wasn't a stranger. He was Dr. Elias Vance, the anchor of faith, the frail old man Thorne had thought he had stopped at the Whispering Chapel. "Vance? You're the architect?" Thorne gasped, struggling to restrain him. Vance's eyes were terrifyingly sane, focused, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Vance is merely an interface, detective. A conduit. The true architect exists in the zero, using the integrated anchors to wear a physical body. Klein's knowledge now gives me access to the tool." Vance, or the entity wearing him, fought with unnatural, surgical strength. He reached for the gauge. Thorne saw the 13 wooden dolls resting on the desk next to the open box. He grabbed one, holding it up like a crucifix. "The 13. Thorne screamed. "The zero sum is 13. Why do you keep using the 13 dolls if you only need 12 anchors?" The entity paused, a flicker of cold, dark amusement crossing Vance's features. "The 12 anchors build the structure. The 13th doll is the key to the gate. And the 13th, final anchor is the one who accepts the geometry as reality, detective. The witness. The 13th anchor, is you." Thorne shoved the doll into Vance's chest. The wood immediately became hot, burning the prison guard uniform. The entity screamed, a sound that was a sickening amalgamation of Vance's voice, the Whistler's whistle, and pure static. The entity threw Thorne off and stumbled back. He abandoned the metal box, its contents too hot to touch. He looked at the final names on the ledger: Vane, Darnell, Reynolds. The structure has the tool, but not the vision. The entity shrieked, clutching its chest. The entity vanished through a back utility door, leaving behind the evidence of his own crime. Thorne stood up, panting, staring at the open metal box and the executioner's gauge. He quickly retrieved the ledger. Anchor 10, E. Vane, the seer. The anchor of vision. Thorne knew who Vane was, a retired homicide detective known for his impossible ability to visualize complex crime scenes from minimal evidence. The vision needed for the full temporal bleed, Thorne took the executioner's gauge from the box. The weight of the final ritual object was heavy in his hand. He looked at the final names, Vane, Darnell, and then Chief Reynolds. The climax was no longer about stopping a series of murders, it was about stopping a ritualistic temporal convergence that would use the Chief's authority to grant reality to the past. Thorne knew the endgame was imminent. The architect, now wearing the integrated knowledge of the anchor of faith, had the executioner's gauge, the tool needed to carve the final geometry. The targets were the last three anchors, Vane, Vision, Darnell, Execution, and the ultimate prize, Chief Reynolds, Authority, the convergence point, Vision and Execution. Thorne raced to the location of Elias Vane, anchor of Vision, the city morgue's forensic observation deck, a room designed to reconstruct crime scenes visually. He found Vane unconscious, the inverted V on his forehead, his integration complete. Resting next to him were 13 dolls. The architect was accelerating the ritual, prioritizing the knowledge over the physical act, but Clara Darnell, anchor of Execution, was still alive. Darnell was the precinct's master armorer, the one who controlled all police firearms and secured the city's old riot gear. Her knowledge of force distribution and physical enactment was the final piece of the structural puzzle before authority. Thorne found Darnell in the precinct's subterranean armory, a secured, concrete bunker. The architect, still wearing Vance's body, was waiting. He had Darnell kneeling, facing a wall where he had just used the executioner's gauge to carve a chillingly perfect, inverted V into the concrete itself. "The anchor of Execution is ready, Detective," the architect hissed, holding the gauge. She knew the physical limits of the riot. Her knowledge, combined with Vane's vision, completes the physical structure. "The gate is ready to be carved." Thorne opened fire. The architect, despite wearing an old man's body, moved with inhuman speed, ducking behind Darnell, using her as a shield. "The anchor of authority is next. The only way to stop the bleeding is to stop the head." The architect screamed, his voice fracturing into the voices of the integrated anchors, static, sound, engine, and now execution. Thorne lowered his weapon, realizing the trap. He couldn't risk Darnell, the architect smirked, then plunged the executioner's gauge deep into Darnell's abdomen. A terrifying, high-pitched whistle, the final note of the whistler's ledger, screamed from the wound. Darnell collapsed, integrated, anchor 11 was secured. The structure was complete, the final anchor, authority. The architect, now radiating raw, geometric power, didn't head for the surface. He ran downwards, toward the precinct's sub-basement, the miasma pit, the ground where the engine, Vic Reyes, was running. Thorne pursued him, reaching the sub-basement where the 5 integrated anchors sat around the miniature Asylum Annex. The structure was now humming violently, vibrating the very ground. Chief Reynolds was already there. He had come down to investigate the unusual noise and the missing officers. He stood, shocked, looking at the bodies of Hansen, Keller, Reed, Silas, and Vic Reyes. "My God, Thorne! What is this madness? You did this?" Chief Reynolds stammered, pulling his sidearm. "No, Chief. It's the architect. He needs you. You're the final anchor, the head of authority." Thorne yelled. The architect leaped onto the table holding the miniature annex, the executioner's gauge raised high. The gauge began to glow with a terrifying, red light. "The 12 anchors are set. The structure is complete. Authority grants the zero-sum permission to cross the bridge." The architect shrieked, aiming the gauge at Chief Reynolds. Thorne, remembering Silas's words, "The architect needs the 13th anchor to accept the geometry as reality," pulled the single wooden doll from his pocket. The doll, the symbol of the 13th anchor, began to glow. He threw the doll not at the architect, but at the humming, pulsating miniature Asylum Annex model. The doll struck the model, instantly short-circuiting the humming engine, Vic Reyes. The model went silent. The geometric power drained away, the zero-sum. The architect screamed in rage and frustration. You broke the engine. The structure is stalled. The structure fails without the witness's full acceptance. Thorne roared, pointing his gun at the executioner's gauge. You needed me to acknowledge the horror, to complete the zero sum. But I won't accept your reality. The architect, desperate, turned the gauge from the chief and slammed it into the concrete floor of the sub-basement, right next to the miasma pit. He began carving a massive, final, inverted V. Then I will open the gate myself. The temporal bleed will begin. As the architect carved the final line, the floor cracked open, releasing a torrent of foul-smelling gas and a sound that was pure, high-pitched madness, the true echo of the asylum riot, but the structure was incomplete. Without the engine to drive the bridge and without the authority to sanction the crossover, the gate was unstable. The echo surged into the architect's body. The entity wearing Vance's form began to convulse violently, the skin stretching and distorting as the raw, unfiltered madness of the past tried to inhabit his unstable conduit. The structure is rejecting the zero sum. Thorne shouted. It's collapsing in on itself. Thorne fired one final, precise shot. Not at the architect, but at the executioner's gauge as it rested in the fracturing concrete. The bullet struck the gauge. The brass and wood shattered, releasing a final, blinding flash of geometric light. The light instantly inverted, becoming a powerful, implosive vacuum. The miasma pit, the fractured floor, the miniature annex, the 13 dolls, and the convulsing